Welcome to another episode of TMI Tuesdays, the women's health podcast where nothing is off limits. I'm Lauren, your new favorite vagina, aka women's health physio, and I'm here to have honest, practical, and unfiltered conversations about women's health across every stage of life. If you enjoy this episode, I'd absolutely love it if you subscribed on Spotify and shared it with someone who might also benefit. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to TMI Tuesdays. It's Lauren here, and today I am joined with a very exciting guest. I am here with Marilee Pumple, who is a registered dietitian and the co-founder of Little Spuds Nutrition. Marilee is also a mom who brings both lived experience and clinical expertise to her work. She specializes in eating disorders and neurodivergent nutrition and is a late identified ADHDer. And I should mention that this is part one of 2 episodes. I'm really excited to have Marilee's partner and co-founder, Lauren Fisher, join us for another episode that we will release on her specific areas of expertise. But today we're going to chat with Marilee about eating disorders and neurodivergent nutrition care. Is that an accurate way of saying it?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. And also around pregnancy or postpartum recovery and relative energy deficiency and some other topics in this area. So that was a long-winded introduction, but thank you so much, Marilee, for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So why don't we start off by you just sharing a little bit about Little Spuds? I know it's evolved over time, so you can maybe introduce the company, how it's evolved, and where you're at today, and a little bit about your area of expertise too.
Yeah, thank you. So Little Spuds is a woman-led, size-inclusive, gender and neurodivergent-affirming nutrition practice. We focus on nutrition across the lifespan, but we have focus areas of pediatric and family nutrition, perinatal, eating disorder care, and then neurodivergent-affirming nutrition care. We have 8 dietitians on our team, which is part of that evolution you're speaking to because it originally started just myself and Lauren. We are based in Victoria, BC, but we support people across the province of BC. And maybe one day we'll expand across Canada is the hope. But yeah, so our practice started out, so I'm eating disorder specialized. Lauren is a pediatric dietitian. We kind of got together during the pandemic and wanted to start a business and wanted to just do more for the community and also just in our areas of practice. I love working in eating disorders, but I just feel like every person that I see is already struggling with disordered eating. And so the both of us wanted to do more around prevention. And so we decided that we were going to do more nutrition support from an eating disorder informed lens for younger clients and hope that that would help with the prevention against development of disordered eating or early intervention, catching things early if parents were seeing red flags in their kids, or even just recognizing signs in themselves around struggling with their relationship with food. And since then, we've added more dietitians. We've focused our practice to have our whole team be eating disorder informed. Originally, we kind of had 2 separate wings of care with pediatric support and eating disorder care. But we just realized there's such a blend where everyone on our team has different areas of specialization, but then we get people that kind of come with so many different backgrounds and identities. And so we really needed a team that could work in multiple areas. So now our entire team is aligned with Health at Every Size. We are all neurodivergent affirming practitioners. We do continuing education around that. We are all working towards being intuitive eating counselors. So myself and Lauren have that training and a couple other dietitians on our team. And yeah, I think that's pretty much the evolution. The other part I would just say is throughout us creating that business, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And so we added in that neurodivergent affirming care kind of like as I got that diagnosis, as I recognized some of the gaps in healthcare and just acknowledged that we really needed this in dietitian care because it doesn't really exist. It's maybe more now we're seeing things, but before it wasn't even anything talked about. I never learned about it in school. And so being really mindful that this matters and needs to be included in our care so that people can have better outcomes.
Yeah, I think neurodivergent affirming care doesn't really exist in many areas of healthcare. And I know we've had conversations around this around physio too, and tools and strategies. And I love chatting with you and learning about ways that we can all improve our practices when we're working with different neurotypes. I love the evolution to more preventative care as well, and
Mhm.
being able to intervene and identify early on. And I think having that neurodivergent affirming lens is probably a huge piece of this. So I know we've chatted about neurodivergent individuals being at higher risk for disordered eating and eating disorders. And I've found this really interesting and have found it really valuable to learn about this area. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about this. So maybe some of the research here, and also what you see in your practice, and how you integrate this into your practice as well.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. So it would probably be helpful to just maybe define neurodivergence,
Yeah.
and what neurotypical is. It's not a medical term, which I think is why it's not super well known, and it gets mixed up a lot. Neurotypical people are people whose brain processing ways of learning, communicating, thinking, regulating emotions is the standard. It's the typical brain functioning. So society standards of care are likely based off of neurotypical brains, as well as I'd say the majority of research is probably done by neurotypical researchers, or based off neurotypical research standards. And so neurodivergent just refers to people whose brains process information or learn or communicate differently than the norm or the typical. And so examples of that would be like ADHD, autism, ADHD, so the combination of ADHD and autism, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyspraxia, just other ways of having a brain, exist in the world. And with that, there's obviously going to be different vulnerabilities that show up in how we exist in the world, how we learn things, how we interact with people. And so from like a nutrition perspective, even if you think about something like food skills, a neurodivergent person is going to learn food skills differently than a neurotypical person, or a neurodivergent person is going to learn what a neurotypical person does for food skills, and they're going to try and match that because that's how they learn that they should be or how they should exist. But if their brain does things differently, it may be that how a neurotypical person does something is actually really difficult. And you could learn to do it differently. But if we think about societal norms, doing something differently is not always acceptable. And so a neurodivergent person may experience a lot of shame if they're doing something in a different way or in a way that is not acceptable to society. And so neurodivergent people learn to mask. So they learn to hide or conceal um, how they may naturally do something to be able to match what a neurotypical person is doing. I know it's a lot of jargon, but it's just trying to highlight like we have these different brains that do different things, but most brains are trying to meet this standard. And for a neurodivergent person, that's extremely difficult. And so when you're masking, and people do it all the time, you even think about like TV shows that are out right now that talk about autistic people dating and having to practice eye contact and have a conversation and ask questions. Like they have to think so hard to do that. And we're telling them that's the right way to have a relationship with someone. But that's incredibly difficult for some people. And so it comes at a cost. And when there's a cost, what does that mean? It can lead to chronic fatigue, exhaustion, difficulty with executive functioning or task initiation. Neurodivergent people are known to hyperfocus on things, especially things, their motivation is often driven by interest. And so there's some things that they can do so well, almost like super level well. And then other things that they just cannot bring themselves to do. So I just like think about myself as an example. Like I have always loved food and cooking. Like my mom and my grandma were big like gardeners and cooks. And so my whole childhood, that's what I did. And I'm so interested in it. And so that is what led me to nutrition. And so I can focus on making some elaborate meal sometimes, but other times I can't. I don't have the same interest in it. And so like making a piece of toast becomes a huge barrier for me because I know I need to eat something. I should be eating something. I can feel that I'm hungry. I'm thinking about making something. I can see the bread right there, but I just can't initiate myself to do it. And then I'm going to shame myself to do it because it's like, if I don't do it, there's a cost and, everything bad could happen and I'll be grumpier. And then I can't, parent as well as I want to parent because I'm going to have, be more reactionary because I haven't eaten enough. And so people fall into these traps all the time. Neurodivergent folks fall into these traps all the time. And then there's also a lot of stigma around what that looks like from the outside. So it looks like, I'm just being lazy. I can't even make a piece of toast. And so then my brain is like, you're lazy. You can't make a piece of toast. And it's just a lot. It's a very negative way of thinking. And so I meet a lot of people in my practice who are like, I used to be able to feed myself, but I just can't access that anymore. Or I've always struggled with my relationship with food. I'm just so mean to myself. Or, sometimes I can do it super well. And then other times, like I can't even function. I'm so exhausted. I can't even get out of bed. And there's a lot of misdiagnosis for neurodivergent people with like depression and anxiety, or they may have concurrent depression and anxiety, but the piece of like how it was caused may be actually related to the burnout associated with being a neurodivergent person, which leads them to become anxious and depressed. So it's a very complicated picture. And then when we think about disordered eating, neurodivergent people have a much higher risk factor for developing disordered eating and eating disorders. And if we think about some of the traits of neurodivergent people that I was already mentioning, but like if you have a hard time initiating tasks or forgetting to eat, or the idea of grocery shopping, preparing food, making the food, storing the food, eating the food, and doing that day after day is really overwhelming, sometimes our brain avoids that. And it's more related to capacity or the functioning or the task initiation than like, oh, I just don't want to eat food, or I'm, not interested in that. And it can lead to a lot of chaos. So ADHD is especially known for living in chaos where, there's a lot of urgency or impulsivity that can show up where they might, forget to do something or delay it until it's like right before they have to leave. And then it's like, well, now I'm going to be late, so I don't eat, or I delay eating all day. Or we use stimulant medication often to manage ADHD, which has an appetite suppressing effect. And so if you are not prioritizing regular eating and you fall into a deficit, then for some people who have genetic vulnerability to an eating disorder, being in a deficit or losing weight associated with a deficit is like a light switch for an eating disorder. Once you turn it on, you can't turn it off. Other features would be like sensory sensitivities. So if you have a lot of foods like textures, smells, taste, or like environmental sensitivities, like you can become very overstimulated in a environment that's like really loud and noisy with like lots of people or lots of smells. So it makes the experience of eating not enjoyable or pleasurable, which a lot of neurotypical people are like, I love food. It's amazing. Like, this is my favorite thing. Or like, I love the feeling of, eating my favorite meal, or the taste is so incredible. But a neurodivergent person might not be able to relate to that experience whatsoever. They actually might find the task or the act of eating really uncomfortable, or the way that they experience cues in their bodies, which we call interoception, is different from a neurotypical person. And so that experience might just be really uncomfortable or annoying or an inconvenience, especially if you're hyper focusing on something that's really important. To have to interrupt that is, maybe even dysregulating. And then to go and eat, which is not a pleasurable experience, you can see how quickly people could fall into under eating. Or even like the impulsivity could lead someone to compensate with like, disordered behaviors like binging and purging, or loss of control eating, or compensatory behaviors.
And then how does the shame piece play into that and eating disorders? Because I know you've mentioned in the past, and I think you mentioned again a few minutes ago, those that are neurodivergent tend to have higher rates of shame response. So how does that play into this?
Yeah. So like I was kind of describing earlier, just that like that really intense shame response. Neurodivergent person isn't experiencing that just once in a while. They might be experiencing that every single day, all day, whether it's internalized from themselves or from the world that they live in, or as a child. I can't remember what the statistic is, but there's some statistic that's like a child with ADHD will receive like 10,000 more commands from a parent than a neurotypical child. So like, put your shoes on. Can you put your shoes on? Why aren't you putting your shoes on? We have to go now. Can you put your shoes on? Why aren't you listening? Can you focus on this? Why aren't you? It's like for a neurodivergent kid, they might hear that over and over and over and over and over again. And then they might learn, well, does that mean like I'm a bad person? Like, why am I not listening? Like, I want to listen. I want to leave on time. I don't want to stress my parents out. And so, like, if you're living in that world and we think about it with food, it just can create a really negative relationship with food or a really unkind relationship with food. And then we live in a world that also has a really convincing diet culture industry, a wellness industry that's worth billions of dollars. And it preys on vulnerable people. So you've got neurodivergent people who are vulnerable, who have a higher shame response, who want to do things right. It's not like they're not trying, and they're motivated to, eat healthier, to correct, their relationship with food. They don't want to feel so horrible when they're eating all the time. They want to not feel so negatively, or they want to not engage in some of these disordered behaviors. And so they start to seek out information. And then this wellness industry is providing a lot of disordered recommendations like fasting and keto diets and this food you can't have and that food you can't have. And like one feature of a neurodivergent brain too is they tend to take things quite literally. And so the nuance that sometimes exists in language isn't always received that way. And I see this a lot in clients who come to me and they've worked with a dietitian in the past or other practitioners and who have made, maybe a recommendation like, for the next week, I want you to try eating X food in the mornings. But like the dietitian didn't mean you have to only eat this food at this time every single morning and you can't have anything else. But the person might receive it that way. And then as soon as they try it out and it doesn't work, their brain might be like, well, you failed. So you didn't get that right. So I always tell people this when they book appointments with me. I'm like, don't cancel all your appointments if it doesn't work. Actually, like, let's come and talk about it because I want to know why it didn't work. I'm interested in the process. Like, what was happening when you tried it out and it didn't work? Versus this idea of like, I tried it, it didn't work, completely derailed me. I need to cancel all my appointments until I get my homework right, and then I can make another appointment. But I have ADHD, so I'm going to forget that I need to make another appointment. And then I'm just going to, drift off into the abyss and forget that I was seeing a dietitian until I'm, really struggling with my relationship with food and have to start the whole process all over again. But I'm really burnt out, and that's tough. So I get a lot of referrals from adults who are, late diagnosed, navigating this new diagnosis, this new world, this new like realization of, well, that's why my brain does the thing, or this is why I interact with food this way. That makes more sense. But I don't know what to do with this anymore. And I feel really bad about it. I also feel really bad that I haven't done anything about it until now.
Yeah. And so how would your practice and the approach you take with this lens and this knowledge and this background, how would that differ from a typical dietitian practice in approaching eating disorders specifically? So what would a neurodivergent affirming practice or care look like for an eating disorder versus a traditional approach?
Yeah, such a good question. And obviously, I'm going to make a lot of assumptions about other dietitians' eating disorder care. But like neurodivergent affirming care is really just affirming a neurodivergent person's identity. So starting with, the assumption that like we know that brains work differently. So I have no idea how you're going to receive the information that I'm going to provide. I have no idea what your learning needs are. And so we have to figure that out together. It needs to be incredibly collaborative. Also want to acknowledge that like dietitians traditionally are trained in eating disorders to do a really long assessment where we typically ask, really vulnerable questions about somebody's relationship with food, their eating disorder history, behaviors they're engaging in. And usually when you're sharing that with someone, especially if it's the first time, like you're pretty tapped out at the end of that. But dietitians often kind of save the end to be like, here's everything you need to know and here's all your interventions. And like a person probably won't even remember that conversation. So in our practice, we actually split assessment into two appointments and tell people at the beginning, like the first appointment is really to just collect information. We're building rapport, we're building safety. What we're talking about is really vulnerable. And the second time we meet is going to be more anything we didn't get to, also acknowledging we may go on some side quests in that information gathering stage and doing more of the planning and logistics where we would go through the assessment together and then we would present ideas on how it would look like to work together to that person. And then they could decide what they want to do with that. If they don't like what we're presenting, we collaborate on something different. But the hope is that the neurodivergent person always feels like they have agency and autonomy in what we're doing, and it's incredibly collaborative. And even if we make a plan, I like to frame everything that we do rather than like goals as more of an experiment. So it's like, why don't we experiment with this for the next 2 weeks? Whether it goes well or not, that's why I want you to come back. We're going to talk about that. That's all the information I want to collect and see if we get the same outcome every time. And experiments are great because you're just collecting information. There's no like pass fail. And so it helps a neurodivergent person to reduce the shame in participating in nutrition care or nutrition counseling. And I always like to tell people, like, I already know that you know how to eat. I already know that you know where to get information about nutrition. I want to help you with the problem solving part, the implementation. And like when you're trying something out and something isn't working, like what's that process? So I can teach you the skill of problem solving so you don't need me. And in eating disorders, it's like oftentimes that's not even talked about. It's like, this is the treatment model. This is what you have to do to participate. This is what you have to do to be able to come into this program or participate in meal support, or you have to be engaging in a level of medical care to be able to participate, which all of that is true. It's evidence-based. It's aligned with the clinical guidelines. But for a lot of neurodivergent people, they can't access that. So to me, it's like, how can we adapt it to increase access so that ideally they can get to the level where they can participate? And so sometimes I'll work with someone who has no doctor, they have no therapist. They've just found me because they listened to some podcast about me on eating disorders. And they
Like
have
this
never
one.
talked, yeah, they've never talked to anybody about their relationship with food. They didn't even think they had an eating disorder until they're listening to me talk about it. And they come to me and they say, like, I don't know what to do. And I would say, old me would have been like, you need to be in a program, you need a doctor, you need a therapist, like right now. And I still think that that's true, but I don't rush it in the same way. Because if I suggest a doctor and they immediately shut down because they've had such horrible experiences with medical care in the past and there's trauma there, that doesn't make sense. So instead, I like to highlight that without a doctor, one, I can't, do my work in the most evidence-based way. Two, there's risk. And so we have to acknowledge safety. And then three, like there's a gap. So we're not doing full evidence-based eating disorder care. It doesn't mean we're not doing any care. There's a gap there, which is not a bad thing. It's just an observation, but I'm still open to trying some things. And then when it's not working, really highlighting like, that makes sense that it's not working. It's nothing to do with you. It's not a deficit in you. It's because we don't have this medical piece. Would you be open to me supporting you, advocate for a safer, more eating disorder informed medical provider who could fill that gap for us? And then we could reassess and see if some of the things we're trying would work better. That's often so much more accessible to a neurodivergent person. It's not coercive. It's not shame-based. It's collaborative. And it's the same thing as,
Not fitting somebody into a box like you were describing traditional programs. It's like evidence-based, but these are the boxes. And then if you don't comply or fit into these boxes, then that's going to drive that shame response even
yeah.
more.
And
And they're, yeah, likely make the disorder worse too, I can imagine.
yeah, and they also just can't participate. So they don't get
Mhm.
any treatment. It's like, I understand programs don't want to adapt, what they're doing so much that they're like making specialized treatment for every single person and then they can't operate their program. Like I understand that. But at some point, like if you're supporting a whole group of people where they're not getting better, they're staying stuck, at some point we need to do some sort of needs assessment and see like is there anything we're doing that might be making this harder, or like ways we could make it better, because this whole group of people with a marginalized identity can't participate and they're not getting better. And we already know like neurodivergent people, because of these challenges, like they have a harder time, getting jobs, retaining jobs. There's a lot of people on disability. There's a lot of people who are struggling with like concurrent chronic disease. And so the part that breaks my heart in this work is someone who finally finds me, but they can't afford regular dietitian treatment. And so now I'm trying to find a nuanced way to support this person the best I can, but also highlighting like, like it makes sense why we're not making as much progress as I would hope, because access is impacted. And like, that's not your fault. That's really unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a challenge for sure in our healthcare system in
Hmm.
general. I know and forgive me, I might get this wrong, but I think you have a saying, fed is best? Is that,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah,
right?
fed is
Yeah.
best.
Yeah. And so I'd love to hear some examples. I think one you gave me before when we were chatting was around, drinking a meal replacement smoothie in the shower. So could you
Mm.
go into some of those principles or examples of, typical typical eating disorder care and maybe some approaches that you would take that are a bit different as well, in addition to the ones you talked about, yeah, shorter assessments or breaking the assessments down. And
Mm.
but yeah, I'd love to hear some more examples like that.
Yeah. So like traditional eating disorder treatment often can include, with dietitians, can often include a meal plan, which could look like, 3 meals and snacks, balanced meals at all meals, plans around how you're going to interrupt vulnerability to eating disorder symptoms. So maybe delaying access to the bathroom after eating or integrating distractions so that you're not sitting alone with your thoughts after eating a meal. For some people, a meal plan works really well, especially if you have support to integrate it. But for someone with ADHD or a neurodivergent person, if you jump from where they're at, which might be that more chaotic eating, like sometimes I eat breakfast, sometimes I don't, sometimes I eat regular meals and snacks and I can access it. And other days I go all day without eating. Some days I don't eat all day and then I might binge and purge at night. And so the eating is just like all over the place. But they look at a meal plan that has meal, snack, meal, snack, meal, snack, all these ideas around food, and they get so overwhelmed because it's like I have to prepare all of that food, and their brain might instantly go to thinking about, okay, it takes this many steps to prepare that meal, it takes that many steps to prepare this meal. I'd have to do that every single day for the next day after day after day, and like I can't even access that, even though we know that that person can eat those foods, or some of those people can eat those foods, but they're not able to access it. So what I do with a lot of people is just try to help them. One, I like them to connect more with their body experience, because they don't need someone to just tell them what they should be doing. They need to have some more like intrinsic connection or internalized motivation around like why they would do something. So I like to explain like the reason why we would recommend eating no meals and snacks is because your metabolism is sending a signal, and when you're not eating regularly, your body is going into starvation mode and trying to conserve energy, and it's going to increase your ADHD symptoms, and it's going to make things harder for you, and your sensory sensitivities are going to be amplified, and your ability to cope is going to be decreased, and you're going to get more dysregulated, or your anxiety is going to be higher. So when they know that, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense why I'm really struggling when my eating looks the way that it does. And so I need help bridging to get more regulated eating. And so as we do that, I try to ask them, like, what does that feel like in your body? Acknowledging it's really hard to eat anything in the morning. But when you do it, what do you notice? What does that feel like? And if they're like, well, I did have a bit more energy, or I was less vulnerable to binge at night, or I was grumpy all day, but I wasn't as grumpy as I was yesterday when I did not do this. And so my hope is it helps them to connect to like their own personal experience, to get buy-in, to like be like, okay, this is really hard. And like, I function better as a human being when I do this. I don't like it, but I can like see a benefit, which that would be that like interest-based motivation, is like if your brain knows there's a reward, it's more likely to access that. And so that's what I'm trying to tap into. And then how do we do that is also to use more like low barrier accessible foods. So rather than saying you're going to start with like a full breakfast, it's like, well, let's just start with something that takes the least amount of, I don't want to say it's like easier, it's because it's probably not, but it's just more accessible, or it's more tolerable. So if someone, like for example, if someone with ADHD, their kitchen is downstairs and they wake up at a certain time, to go downstairs is a big transition. And so they may just not be able to access going downstairs and making food. So I might suggest, like, could you put a low barrier food at bedside? So you wake up and the first thing you do is you either eat a granola bar, or you have like a Boost or an Ensure that can be shelf stable. And at your bedside, you're just going to take the lid off and you're going to drink it. It might not be fun. It might not be enjoyable. It might be a huge sensory adverse reaction, but it's the thing that we need to get our brain back online, stop this starvation mode turning on, and then ideally they could access that. Or it might be like, well, they might have a routine already that works for them. Like every time I wake up, I have to get in the shower right away, because if I don't, I won't shower for 2 days. It's like, okay, well, take it in the shower with you, drink it in the shower, so that you're completing that task and then moving on with your day. And so we're just trying to like integrate things into their daily routine, the system, change the system if we need to, increase access to the system, because their brain may have already established a routine of tasks that they're doing, and interrupting that might be really stressful for them. Sometimes I can tell when I work with someone, if I suggest something and they immediately shut down, like, okay, what was it that I just said that
Yeah.
that led you to have that reaction? And they're like, what do you mean? They might even know they're having the reaction. Like, okay, well, I just said, could you put milk in your tea at night? And you immediately shut down. Tell me, is that accurate? And they're like, oh, okay, well, I already drank milk earlier in the day. So the idea of drinking milk again, I don't think I could do that. And every time I drink my tea, I always only put sugar in it. So to put milk in my tea doesn't work for me. And it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Let's choose a different food. I'm just suggesting milk because you're already drinking a tea. So I'm trying to make it less of a barrier for you to have another food. But that makes a lot of sense to me when they say like, well, it's because of this. I already have this system in place. And so then we suggest another food. They're like, oh yeah, I could do that. And they don't shut down. But if I didn't ask that, it may have just, and they agreed like, okay, yeah, I could do that with like a noticeable change in like body language and tone. In the past, when I would meet with them again, if they would even come, it's like, oh, I didn't do that. Okay, well, do you think you could try again? Yeah, I could try again. It's like they're agreeing with me because they think they want to meet the expectation that I have. But I'm just trying to suggest something that's more accessible to them, but I'm not getting all the information. So that's what I'm trying to set up at the very beginning. Like, we want to have really good communication around your experience, especially if what I suggest doesn't work, or if you're trying it out and you think you can do it, but you get derailed. Like, I really want to know what's happening so we can decrease that shame piece, which often leads people to stop engaging.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that for sure. Again, fitting into that box and yeah, being creative and working in collaboration. Being able to read that body language is key to that is a missing piece, I think, for a lot of practitioners in healthcare for sure. So why don't we chat a little bit about how this plays into maybe REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport and exercise culture, specifically with women. Most of the listeners here for this podcast are women. So I'd love to dive into that a little bit more with you. So that overlap between, well, maybe we can start by defining what relative energy deficiency or REDS in sport is and exercise culture and eating disorders.
Yeah, so relative energy deficiency in sport is often, I think the definition is like impaired physiological or psychological functioning that's caused by problematic low energy availability. And low energy availability just means when there's insufficient intake of fuel to support the energy expenditure from exercise, or what your body needs for normal functioning and health and daily living. And so if you're an athlete, you already have exponentially higher energy needs than the average person. Because you're doing more training activity, you probably have higher muscle mass, you probably have a higher metabolic rate or metabolism. So, like the rate at which you're converting fuel into energy. And then if you don't meet that higher calorie needs, then you are in an energy deficiency. And so depending on like what your training looks like, how often you're training, if you have like, let's say you're doing regular training throughout the week, but then you have a weekend where your training needs are much higher. If you're not accounting for that, you can fall into this energy deficiency. And then over time, your body doesn't like that. And so REDS is highlighting all the features that can happen from being in an energy deficiency. And it is really just a list of malnutrition, but it also is malnutrition in relation to performance and recovery. And so it can look like impaired menstrual or reproductive functioning, impacts to bone health, so like higher risk of fractures, impacts to cardiovascular health. Some people can be like really dizzy or fainting. They might experience like electrolyte shifts, impacts to immunity. So like you might get sick more often. You could be losing weight. You could be losing muscle mass. You could be having challenges with like continence. So like urinary incontinence. Focus, performance, mental health impacts. The most recent paper on REDS from the IOC from 2023 talks more about a focus on mental health. We used to think with REDS that it was really just related to calories. Like if you don't get enough calories in and you're doing a higher level of activity, that this relative energy deficiency is only related to caloric needs. So you just have to make sure you hit your calories. But we now know that it's not just calories. You have to have consistent intake of calories as well as carbohydrates to not get REDS or not fall into that low energy availability. I think the thing to point out about REDs or the low energy availability is that we often think that it's intentional. Like we're intentionally trying to lose weight or diet or eat less, or, maybe even like you're recommended to eat less or lose weight to be faster or to perform better, or you're reading online that if you were just a little bit smaller, like that would help. But if you are in that deficit for too long, there's a huge cost, and that often impacts an athlete's ability to participate in the sport, performance, and some don't even know that they're experiencing REDs. So there's the people who might intentionally be trying to modify things, and then there's the other people who they're just trying to eat enough, but they don't know that they're actually not eating enough, because it's really hard to eat enough. And especially if their exercise output is changing, or one day they might get enough, but then the next day they don't get enough. And so you can go in and out of REDs as well, or in and out of that low energy availability, because it's so hard to consistently meet those needs. And then if we think about the connection of being neurodivergent, just feeding yourself is hard. So if you're a neurodivergent athlete, or you're a neurodivergent person who has a complicated relationship with food, who really likes exercise, and you're not mindful of making sure that you're getting enough consistent nutrition, you might be falling into this REDS category, which obviously needs to be assessed by a medical professional. But when you also add that higher risk of neurodivergent people developing eating disorders, and I think the stats are like 25 to 30% of people with eating disorders are neurodivergent. And especially young athletes, I think, is one of the greatest risks. Like young athletes, especially like young athletes with ADHD or assigned female at birth, teenagers have probably the highest risk. I think it's like a 12 times higher risk of engaging in like loss of control eating. There's a 6-time higher risk of developing bulimia nervosa. They say that 20% of kids with ADHD will get an eating disorder. 50% of people with anorexia show autistic traits. So if you just think about that group of people who might even be using exercise as a way to navigate their neurodivergent symptoms, because if you are, a high energy, impulsive person, you have a hard time focusing with it functioning. But when you exercise, like it all makes sense. And so some neurodivergent people are amazing athletes because exercise is a really great tool to regulate their brain. It has similar effects to using like stimulant medication. But if you're not mindful of prioritizing nutrition, then you could fall into relative energy deficiency. You could also fall into relative energy deficiency and turn on an eating disorder. And I see a lot of people who are athletes who are neurodivergent, who also have eating disorders, or they're querying an eating disorder. And it's like, it's just not worth it. Like getting support around getting enough fuel is so important because it's so preventative. And if something is showing up or you're curious about it, like it's so important to act on it immediately, because you can't just turn an eating disorder off. Like once you have an eating disorder, it can take years of treatment to get to recovery. And some people don't get to recovery. Some people get to a place of management of their eating disorder, which has, long-term chronic health implications to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the education piece is so important because, like you said, a lot of people, it's not intentional. I know we had Alex Thompson on the podcast, who's a
I
physio
love
and
Alex.
specializes in working with dancers. And, this is a big group where this is an issue. I think they've coined it now
Mm-hmm.
Red D, so relative energy deficiency in dance. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of these young dancers are just training so many hours, they don't even have time to make a meal, or they're going off to university for the first time and they're alone
Mm-hmm.
and they haven't been taught the food skills to cook. And so it's not necessarily a conscious choice. It becomes this, they're just lacking the time and the space to make it a priority. And then I think also with birth control, a lot of our hallmark sign of
Mm-hmm.
REDS was loss of period, right? But if we're on birth control, then we don't have those natural signs that, that are, or the natural feedback mechanisms, I guess, of
Mm-hmm.
this. So I think the education piece and understanding all of the risk factors and signs and symptoms and working with younger people, younger active people earlier in these spaces like dance and other sports is really key. So I think it's important conversations to have. And
Mm-hmm.
also like you mentioned, and we talked about the shame piece, right? If you recognize these things, it's okay. Don't beat yourself up. There's help and support. And that's why we're having these conversations, not to shame people for, maybe where they're at in their life, but to get them to
Mm-hmm.
recognize, so then they can start to take care of themselves before it gets too far into it.
Yeah, yeah, it's such a good point. I always like tell people when I can tell that shame piece is kind of like sneaking in, or they're like, "Oh, I should have done this," or "Why did I like let this get so far?" I just like to frame it as like all information is valuable. Like it's just really helpful. Like today we learned something that is going to inform what we do in the future, and the more information that we can get, the more of an informed decision we can make for ourselves. And it's not a bad thing that you didn't have that information before. Or maybe you did have it, but like you just weren't able to access it yet, or you weren't in a place where you felt that it was fully meaningful to you yet. But now you're noticing that it is. And so what do we do about that? How do we get support to access that? How do we integrate it? If you're scared to integrate it, like definitely get support. Like it's not worth it to try to do it alone and then get derailed and then just never go back to it because of that shame piece. It makes sense to try to enlist some support, or even just like we talk about body doubling a lot with ADHD or neurodivergent folks, where sometimes we just need another person present or for accountability to get started or transition into the thing that we've been trying to do. And so I encourage a lot of neurodivergent folks, if you're thinking about something and need help with it, like get someone to help body double you to be able to move towards accessing it.
Mhm. Yeah. That was the first time I'd heard that concept was from you. I mean, it makes sense when you describe it, and I'm like, oh yes, I've seen that all the time. But having the name to it is helpful. Speaking of turning eating disorders on, I wanted to touch on, maybe this is the last area we can go in, but I wanted to touch on the postpartum period and
Mm,
culture, that bounce back culture, and also, people getting back into exercise postpartum, or athletes returning to sport postpartum, and some of the pieces around that being a time period for potentially risk of turning on eating disorders as well. Can you speak to that?
yeah. So like with eating disorders, obviously like anyone can get an eating disorder. So I should just start there. Any person can get an eating disorder, but there's like a genetic vulnerability for some folks, which is usually the highest factor that leads someone to get an eating disorder. And then there's other factors that increase risk, like personality traits, being neurodivergent, we can add that in, being of a marginalized identity, different socioeconomic status. There's lots of pieces that contribute to making someone vulnerable for developing an eating disorder. But if someone is losing weight, or they are in an energy deficit, or they're not eating enough, those are often the precipitating factors that turn the eating disorder on. And so it's not to say that someone can never lose weight, or they can not change their body, or they cannot, go periods of time without eating. It's more like we don't know. I don't know like who potentially is the most vulnerable person at stake if that's happening. And that's why like I'm a health at every size provider. I don't recommend intentional weight loss, but I do support a lot of people who may choose to pursue weight loss, or they might be in a place where they're already pursuing weight loss and wanting help with their relationship with food. And they might transition away from that and moving towards like a more of an intuitive eating approach to their relationship with food. But just being mindful that like when you look at the health recommendations on weight loss, it's so slow. Like it's very, very slow. And a lot of people are like, how do I get there the fastest way possible? And so if your body doesn't like that, then that could be a factor as well. It's not designed to do that. And so some people, if you think about postpartum, like your body is changing. Some people's bodies change really quickly. And I don't know what the research is on like pace of bodies changing postpartum, but like I would be curious, someone who loses weight really quickly, like is it because their environment is incredibly stressful? Their baby is not sleeping at all. They're not sleeping at all. Their baby is feeding constantly. Are they feeding themselves regularly? Are they, getting enough support at home? Do they have enough financial support? Are there any challenges with their health or their baby's health? It's not this like simple picture where everyone just like loses a lot of weight really quickly, but there's like this societal pressure that that's the way that it should be. So then we have some people whose bodies aren't doing that, but they see other people's bodies doing that. And so that increases the pressure for them, or this expectation that they should be doing that. But we have no idea what the other person's circumstance is.
Mhm.
And then they might,
Anecdotally,
yeah.
anecdotally and clinically, I don't have the research on this. It's not
Mhm.
something I've ever dove in, but just what I see in my practice. practice is actually
Yeah.
a larger percentage of people gaining weight postpartum who
Right.
are breastfeeding. And they're so
Yeah.
shocked and upset about this because they're like, I'm breastfeeding, chest feeding. And I thought that
Yeah.
just, burned the weight so fast. But I
Hmm.
actually see those factors that you've described, the cortisol, the stress, the sleep, the lack of support, sometimes as being actually doing the opposite. People
Yeah.
are gaining weight postpartum, which is something they've never heard of, and they're so it's really hard and challenging because that's not at all what they expected. Also,
Hmm. Totally. Yeah. And even like gaining weight while you're chest feeding makes sense. Like your body, why would your body want to be losing weight when it's needing to produce more energy to feed your baby? So it's like it's kind of like if you think about when people lose their period because they're malnourished, it's because your body has associated or your brain has associated your body as like not ready to menstruate or not able to menstruate, or it's not the priority. Like, why would we procreate right now when we don't have enough fuel to do basic functionings like have our heart and our liver and our lungs work properly? So why would we prioritize that? So it's one of the pieces of our body to conserve energy stops menstruation. So if someone is chest feeding and they have a baby that's initiating that process and their body is initiating the process of chest feeding, like to be losing weight and producing adequate milk doesn't really make a ton of sense. Obviously, your body's going to adjust after having a baby, but we don't need to expedite that process. And often, what I see often is people who are breastfeeding or chest feeding, but they're having issues with supply because they're also trying to lose weight at the same time, and they're not eating enough, or they're not drinking enough, and they're exercising excessively, and so their body is trying to give them feedback like this isn't working. And obviously, like, supply is a complicated topic too, because it's not just related to intake. Sometimes our bodies just don't produce enough milk, and there's no shame in that. And I was one of those people that didn't produce enough milk, and it was really stressful of like, what am I doing wrong? How am I failing my child right now? So I would encourage getting support with lactation if that's something that impacts you. But to have that on top of this like pressure to change your body, even just like wanting to feel like yourself, I think that's the part that stands out to me the most is like, after I had a baby, I didn't feel like myself anymore. I was no longer pregnant identity where my body made sense as a pregnant person. I'm taking care of my baby. I don't feel like myself. I can't do any of the things that I used to do, especially in that like initial survival period at the beginning. You're, probably on your phone, going through social media, especially like when you're feeding at all hours of the night and your baby's sleeping on you. And we just are inundated with diet culture and all sorts of content that just makes us feel like crap about ourselves. And then you've got neurodivergent people who have that added, shame response, or they're already really vulnerable, or they're not functioning at all because they're in major burnout. They can't access things the same way when they're, not sleeping. Their symptoms might be more amplified. I don't know what the research is or the statistics are, but a lot of people get diagnosed with ADHD in the postpartum period because their symptoms become so much more apparent. And once they rule out, like, it's not postpartum anxiety, it's not postpartum depression, something else is wrong. Something else is happening where I'm having such a hard time keeping up with like feeding myself, feeding my baby, taking care of the house, doing all the things. Like, I can't do it. And later on, it's like, I found out I had ADHD. It's like, oh, that makes more sense now. And then, ideally they get some support. Maybe they become medicated if they choose to do that. And then they're more able to function. But it's still really, really tough. And I see so many people with complicated relationships with food at so many different life stages, but postpartum is a very vulnerable life stage. Even pregnancy, like, there's so much focus on like what's your stomach measuring this month? What's your weight today? And you get weighed in the waiting room in front of everybody. Everybody's standing there and it's like, oh, you gained just the right amount of weight. You're good. Oh, you gained too much weight. We need to talk about that. Oh, you didn't gain any weight. Oh, we need to talk about the risks to your baby. It's like so much stress for moms navigating that, thinking about their bodies.
so much pressure. Yeah. And like you said, then you add social media onto all of it. And social media does a really bad job of reflecting nuance to things. And so you're going to get
Yeah.
mixed messaging at every turn. And it just doesn't provide context that is so important for so many people. So, yeah, very tough. So, if anybody was listening today who identifies with any of this, whether they're identifying as some of the neurodivergent side that you were discussing or the eating disorder side, what would be maybe some take homes or advice that you would give for people moving forwards here?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to my life philosophy of fed is best that you mentioned earlier of like, it's so important to prioritize regular eating. I say this to all my like young clients. It's like make eating lunch and breakfast cool again, because those are often the first things to go when kids are in school and they start doing things for themselves. But like eat breakfast, eat lunch, eat dinner, try to eat regular meals, try to eat snacks, choose the lowest barrier option. It does not matter if society says it's a good or a bad food. Just eat something rather than nothing to prevent that energy deficit as like the first number one priority. If you have long gaps in your day where you're not eating, even anything to interrupt that, like even a drink, like oral nutrition supplements like Boost and Ensure exist. They're not amazing and sexy, but like they exist for a reason to fill those gaps, to provide something rather than nothing. And often it bridges people to like be able to access their food skills again once their brain is back online and they're eating more regularly. It kind of reminds me of like the airplane recommendation of like put your mask on first before helping somebody else, and like you just have to feed yourself more consistently to be able to take care of your family, your kids, yourself, and even if you're going to be integrating exercise. So I'd start there. If you suspect disordered eating, if you're querying whether you are neurodivergent or not, like medical assessment is recommended. I know it's not safe for everybody to do that. It's also not accessible for everybody to do that, but that would be the first recommendation. Or trying to find a safe provider, or bringing someone with you if you're not sure to navigate that system, I think is a good recommendation too. I will include like my major bias of working with a dietitian. If you are struggling with your relationship with food, if you're newly diagnosed ADHD, if your kids are newly diagnosed neurodivergent, see a dietitian, because there are things that we can do to make your child's life easier around food, your life easier around food, improve outcomes for relationship with food, prevent against disordered eating and eating disorders. If you suspect an eating disorder, definitely first line would be a doctor for sure, but working with an eating disorder informed dietitian and therapist would be recommended as well. We have a team of 8 dietitians who have that background and can support people. So if you're in BC, definitely come our way, and we often even provide other resources to practitioners that can complement the care that we do or be a better fit. Like we just want everybody to have a better relationship with food. It's so important.
Yeah, those are such good points. And we'll have Lauren Fisher, your co-founder and business partner, on for part 2 to dive more into pediatric side of things, which will be really interesting conversation. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. So if anyone wants to connect with you, Marilee, what's the best way to do so?
You can find us on our website at www.littlespudsnutrition.com, or we're on Instagram at spudsnutrition.com, or I have my own Instagram as well. It's at Marilee_dietitian. You can send us a message on any of those platforms, and I can always match people to dietitians on our team. But that's the best place to get in touch with us.
I'll link that information in the show notes as well for people if they're interested. Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I always learn so much when I chat with you. So thanks for coming on. And I hope everyone enjoyed the episode as much as I did. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of TMI Tuesdays. I hope you have a good rest of your week, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much, Marilee.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of TMI Tuesdays. Women's health is complex, nuanced, and deserves better conversations. If this episode resonated with you, I would absolutely love if you followed and subscribed to the podcast on Spotify and shared it with someone who might need to hear it. We'll see you again next Tuesday.